In the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,500 kilometers east of South America, lies a small group of windswept islands known to the British as the Falklands and to the Argentinians as Las Malvinas. To most of the British public, the islands were insignificant. But for Argentinians, these rocky islands represented an old national wound, one which had festered for 150 years since the British occupied the islands, removing them from Argentinian control in 1833. The passing of time did not ease Argentine feelings of national humiliation. Instead, Las Malvinas became a rallying point for Argentine national identity. Schoolchildren were taught that Las Malvinas were rightfully Argentinian, by history as well as by the contours of the Atlantic seafloor.
Argentina, las Malvinas aparecen ubicadas en la zona austral. Toda esa distancia que hay está separada por el mar. Ese mar que es el mar argentino.
The Malvinas are a national cause in Argentina. Pupils in primary school learn about their lost heritage, of how the British stole the islands from them in 1833. Youngsters are shown that the islands are part of Argentina's continental shelf.
La plataforma continental va a ser la prolongación del continente por debajo del agua.
From a South American perspective, Britain's claim to the islands is absurd. Even an unpopular dictatorship would be acclaimed if it could recover the Malvinas.
The sovereignty of Las Malvinas was the one thing that everybody in Argentina could agree about. In 1982, a desperate Argentine government would use this universal national feeling towards Las Malvinas to rally the country behind them. The government in question was the military dictatorship known as the National Reorganization Process. The junta was characterized by its contemptuous treatment of its enemies. It brutally suppressed its domestic rivals and threatened its foreign rivals with war. It cowed Brazil into submission in a dispute over water rights by threatening to build a nuclear bomb, and in December of 1978, the military invaded Chile over 3 uninhabited islands along their border in the South Atlantic. The invasion was halted by papal mediation. Nonetheless, it was clear that the Argentine military government was not afraid to go to war to get what it wanted. However, their bellicose foreign policy had a cost, a financial cost. Supplying one's army and navy and air force with the most modern planes, tanks, and munitions was expensive. In the 70s, credit was easy, allowing the Argentine government to run up huge debts buying military goodies. However, at the end of that decade, interest rates spiked, and Argentina, along with many other countries around the world, found it increasingly difficult to pay their creditors while maintaining their budgets. Finally, in early 1982, Mexico defaulted on its debt. The default sent shockwaves through the global economy. In Argentina, inflation and unemployment were crippling the domestic economy, and people by the thousands took to the streets to protest. The Argentine junta, with its back to the wall, did the only thing it knew how to do. On April 2nd, in 1982, Argentine forces made landfall on Las Malvinas.
4 a.m., April the 2nd, 1982. Argentine Navy cameramen film their invasion of the Falkland Islands. Frogmen landed first from a submarine, followed later by the main assault force. It was an historic day for Argentina.
When news of the British garrison's surrender reached the Argentine mainland, the mood of the country changed dramatically. People returned to the streets, not to protest the government, but to praise it. The Argentine flag could be seen everywhere.
When news of the invasion reached Buenos Aires, the crowds went wild. The military regime's record of violent repression, the economic crisis, all were forgotten overnight. The national dream of reoccupying the Malvinas had been realized.
Expected they had won. Surely the British government would not fight for the Falklands, a distant, sparsely populated, and strategically unimportant chain of islands. They dramatically underestimated the influence of those few thousand residents on the Falklands, people who saw themselves as British subjects and had no desire to be subjects of Argentina. The junta stepped on the tail of a sleeping lion. The United Kingdom would fight. The integrity of their own national identity was at stake.
On April 2nd, 1942, about 100 Argentinian Marines landed on the Falklands. These Marines were the first wave of 2,000 soldiers devoted to seizing the island. Their objective was to capture the capital Stanley and force the British governor of the islands to surrender. This news made it to England incredibly fast. The BBC broadcasted that same day saying,
"The Falkland Islands, the British colony in the South Atlantic, has fallen. But that's what Argentina is saying. It claims its Marines went ashore as a spearhead this morning to capture key targets, including the capital, Port Stanley."
The Marines moved up to the government's house and surrounded it and its 69 Royal Marine defenders, demanding the surrender of the islands. The British governor, Rex Hunt, was trapped inside the house and sent out one last broadcast before he and the defenders were taken prisoner.
They've got us well and truly pinned down, and that they're not trying to attack. I'm not surrendering to the bloody arches, certainly not. It's probably the last message I'll be able to give you. I wish you all the best of luck, and rest assured that the British will be back.
The governor and Royal Marines were escorted off the island and sent back to Britain, leaving the civilians to wonder what on earth would happen to them. 8,000 miles away from Britain, the islanders were left all alone. The Argentinians believed that the British would simply give up the islands and not retaliate. However, they had not taken into account the tenacity of England's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher.
As the crowd celebrated, Galtieri was confident that Britain would not react. He assumed that because the distant Falklands was hardly a vital British interest, Britain would not fight for them. But Galtieri was making one crucial error. He'd seriously underestimated Britain's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. In 1982, Britain's first female Prime Minister was governing a country in trouble. Britain was in recession. Unemployment had just passed the 3 million mark, and there'd been some of the worst rioting of the 20th century. But Thatcher was a formidable character. She knew that to hesitate could spell doom for her unpopular government. She summoned Parliament and gave a defiant response to Argentina's invasion.
We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. HMS Invincible will be in the lead and will leave port on Monday.
Spring of 1982, the task force departed for the Falkland Islands. The force departed on their 8,000-mile journey across the Atlantic Oceans. It had 93 ships in all, consisting of warships, supply ships, and even a cruise liner. In the center of the fleet were two aircraft carriers, the HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes. The Hermes would be the flagship. It took 3 weeks for the ships to make the journey to the Falklands. Britain would try for a diplomatic solution throughout the 3 weeks, but to no avail. The British planned to gain air superiority for their transport ships to launch an amphibious landing. The only way to retake the Falklands would be to have boots on the ground. The Argentinian army, meanwhile, was digging in for the assault. Their troops were filled with recruits and young soldiers, so to make up for this, the Argentinian army called for reserve and retired groups to come back into service for the country. They wanted their military experience to stiffen the ranks. By the end of April, there were 13,000 Argentinians on the Falkland Islands. Lucky for the Argentinians, the islands were only 400 miles away from the shores of Argentina, putting them in the range of air support from their mainland air force. The Argentinian troops divided into a few garrisons. They positioned 2,000 men on West Falkland, 1,000 men in the city of Goose Green, and the bulk of the army, numbering around 10,000, in the hills surrounding the capital of Stanley. The battle for the Falklands began in the air on May 1st, 1982. The British planes were heavily outnumbered by the might of the entire Argentinian Air Force. However, they had a few tricks up their sleeve. The Sea Harrier was a new plane that they had brought with them. The airplane was brand new and untested in combat. However, it was equipped with the ability to take off and land vertically, allowing it to work better from short runways such as aircraft carriers. It was also armed with the first heat-seeking missile called Sidewinder. In the first day alone, 4 Argentinian aircraft were shot down from these new missiles. Another 15 would follow the next day. The British seemed to have taken a massive advantage in the conflict. However, the Argentinians had a few tricks of their own. They started a pincer movement with 2 separate forces of ships, one heading directly for the British and one heading around the island to attack from the rear. More alarmingly, however, they had recently purchased 5 new missiles, the Exocet missiles. These missiles would seek out ships and could sink an entire aircraft carrier if they got within range of 30 miles. The British could not afford to lose a carrier because that meant losing the battle in the air. Therefore, the British ordered a submarine attack the ships that were flanking from the south. The submarine launched its torpedoes and sank the entire southern force. The entirety of the Argentine Navy retreated, fearing more submarine attacks. However, the Argentinians responded by sending out the first of their 5 missiles, sinking the HMS Sheffield, making it the first British ship to be damaged ever since the Second World War. The Argentinians also sank 3 more ships using these missiles. Eventually, the head of the British task force decided they could wait no longer for an attack. He selected the Bay of San Carlos as their landing spot. The nearby hills would protect the men from the air force of the Argentinians. However, 5 warships were hit and 2 ships had been sunk in the landing process, for the bay offered no protection against the Argentinian fighter bombers. All the men on the land could do was sit and watch as their ships were bombarded again and again. The Argentinians also sunk the cruise liner that had just arrived from Britain, carrying the helicopters the land force had hoped to use to fly closer to the capital Stanley, hurting the land campaign before it even started.
We watched with lumps in our throats as Antelope raged with fire and finally sank. She was our escort and everybody felt a great loss, as she was more than just a ship to us.
While the British were reeling from these attacks, the Argentinians were celebrating their success. Menendez, the commander of the Argentinian forces on the island, was celebrating the National Day of Argentina on May 24th, promising his men a swift victory over the British.
But it wasn't over yet. The Argentinian Air Force was preparing another raid that would hit the British land campaign where it really hurt.
The British had a daunting task ahead of them. Margaret Thatcher commanded the troops to begin their march towards Stanley, but the men were still 50 miles away, and with no helicopters, they had to walk the entirety of the distance. The British force split into two parties. The main unit of 2,000 men continued on its way to Stanley. However, one unit of 500 men went towards the city of Goose Green.
The Argentinians had a base at Goose Green because of its strategic importance. It's on a narrow strip of land just 5 miles long by a mile wide.
They encountered the base of the Argentinians and were instantly pinned down in the open fields surrounding the area. Their task was to capture the Air Force base that had just been built outside of the city of Goose Green. They were taking heavy fire from the Argentinians holding the city and those that were located in the airport directly outside of the city. The commander of the paratroopers devised a tricky ploy, however. He warned the Argentinians, after destroying their flank, that he would bombard them heavily and hold them responsible for any civilian lives lost if they did not surrender. Incredibly, the Argentinians did surrender. Over 1,000 Argentinian troops, 3 times as many as the British had planned on fighting, surrendered to about 400 or so British paratroopers.
After 6 weeks under Argentinian occupation, Goose Green was back in British hands, and the soldiers of Two-Para were heroes. But the battle for this tiny place had come at a huge cost.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain James, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan.
More than 70 soldiers were dead, 16 British and over 50 Argentinians.
Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley.
What had begun as a quick raid to seize back the airstrip and liberate the community had turned into a bloody battle in the struggle for the Falkland Islands.
The main force had equal troubles taking the capital. While unloading more soldiers to join the main force outside of Stanley, the Argentinian Air Force scored another blow to a British transport. 49 men were killed in the bombing. However, Menendez was told that 900 British men were killed in the attack. He therefore expected a slackening in the advance of the British and essentially a surrender. The British, however, would give him a major shock. They planned a three-prong attack on the Argentinian positions outside Stanley, and decided to only attack at night to avoid the planes of the Argentinians. Once they took the three hills, they would have a short walk to Stanley itself. The better trained British soldiers fought excellent in the dark, being required in training to fight as well at night as well in the day. They quickly took the first of the three hills with minimal casualties. The third hill, however, proved to be more troublesome. The rocks here formed a natural maze that stumbled and confused the British. It funneled them into channels, allowing the Argentinians to rain grenades and bullets down into their ranks. One British soldier was quoted as saying,
"It's actually quite bewildering. Just moving around in these conditions is very difficult. You're weighed down by your equipment. There's people tripping over, falling in the frozen stream and turning ankles. The enemy is not the only challenge in this dark and difficult terrain."
Despite all this, the men eventually were able to climb all the way to the top of the hill and surprise the Argentinian defenses from behind. Now having the upper ground, the hill defenses fell within minutes and the Argentinian troops retreated back into Stanley. Menendez, hoping not to lose the hills, ordered his artillery to fire down on the last remaining hill, endangering his own men's lives in the process, to no avail.
As day broke, the British brought in the dead and injured from both sides. Most of the Argentinian casualties and prisoners were conscript soldiers, young men drafted into the army. While these soldiers had fought well, many of them were worn down by the conditions before the battle had begun. Some of them were even captured in their positions, like this one, huddled up in their sleeping bags trying to escape the battle and the cold.
I am tired, cold, unhappy. I swear that I can't take it anymore, even though this is my duty as a man and a soldier of the fatherland.
Although this had been a bloody battle for both sides, the British attacks had taken all the high ground they'd planned to on the first night. But another night's fighting still lay ahead.
The British then set up shop and began to bombard the remaining Argentinian positions and Stanley itself. The entirety of the Argentinian troops began to flee, returning back into Stanley.
In their hundreds, the Argentinian resistance was crumbling. As the demoralized defenders poured into Stanley, the men were heard arguing with their superiors. Discipline among the Argentinian troops was breaking down.
Menendez eventually realized there was no hope and no discipline among his now demoralized troops, and surrendered to the British. On the 14th of June, the British marched into Stanley, and the battle for the Falklands was over after 2.5 months.
Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
The Argentinians had occupied Stanley for 74 days. But now, as 2 Para marched into the capital, it was back in British hands.
One month later, the British forces returned home as heroes. National pride was restored in the face of Britain's decline. Margaret Thatcher won the general election within a year and was seen as a major world leader. In Argentina, on the other hand, citizens were left angry at the loss and furious at the military and the government. 3 days after the surrender, General Leopoldo Galtieri resigned from office and the military dictatorship began its downward spiral.
esfuerzo de todos, absolutamente de todos los argentinos. Y en todas partes he dicho, y permítanme que lo repita hoy, porque es como un rezo laico y una oración patriótica. Y si alguien distraído al costado de camino cuando nos ve marchar, nos pregunta cómo juntos, hacia dónde marchan, por qué luchan, tenemos que contestarles con las palabras del preámbulo, que marchamos, que luchamos para constituir la Unión Nacional, afianzar la justicia, consolidar la paz interior, proveer a la defensa común, promover el bienestar general y asegurar los beneficios de la libertad para nosotros, para nuestra posteridad y para todos los hombres del mundo que deseen habitar el suelo argentino.
The wide men have found little space in this contest. It is not true of Olatico Echea at the moment, but certainly it's been true of the England team. Haven't seen that much of Hodge or Trevor Steven. And Maradona just walked away from Hoddle then. Valdano, Hodge and Maradona! They're appealing for offside. The ball came back off the foot of Steve Hodge, and Maradona gives Argentina the lead. The England players protesting to the referee. But the little man who started it by walking past Glenn Hoddle, that's where the ball came from Hodge. Maradona had continued the run forward, and the goal is given. At what point was he offside? Or was it a use of the hand that England are complaining about?